We're going through right now 1 Samuel, and then we're going through 1 Chronicles at the same time. And we'll do so when we get to 2 Samuel as well. And then, but through 1 Samuel, which we're going through right now, in 1 Chronicles, we divided 1 Samuel into three sections. The first of those is Samuel, which we're going to finish up with chapter 8 tonight. The second of those, and these are just based on who the character we're following mostly throughout this time frame is, we're going to follow the story of Saul in 9 through 15. And then we're following David from 16 through 31. So that's how we divided the book up last week. Samuel 1 to 8, Saul 9 to 15, and David 16 to 31. The book of 1 Chronicles, which we're going through as well, divides into two major sections. 1 to 9 is a list of genealogies, and then 10 to 29 is the reign of David. So for right now, we're going through rather quickly 1 Chronicles is just a long list of genealogies and names. But once we get started in 2 Samuel, when we get to 1 Chronicles 10, we're going to see a lot of parallel accounts from the reign of David from 1 Chronicles 10 to 29 and through the book of 2 Samuel. But before we go to 1 Samuel, go to 1 Chronicles 4. 1 Chronicles 4, really a couple of major sections there. 1 to 23 is dealing with the family of Judah. Judah, Perez, Hezron, Carmi, Hur, Shobal, and so on. And then the sons of Simeon beginning at verse 24 and going through the end of the text there in 1 Chronicles chapter 4. And so again, it's a long list of names. We'll not spend any more time there in 1 Chronicles 4 because we have a lot of stuff to get through in 1 Samuel 8 through 11 this evening. So let's go ahead and go to 1 Samuel chapter 8. And Israel asks for a king. 1 Samuel chapter 8. Israel asks for a king. This text divides itself into three sections. The first of those is Israel's asking a request for a king. Let's look beginning at verse 1. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of the firstborn was Joel, and the name of the second Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. We'll stop there for just a second before we move on. So here we have the sons of Samuel. Now, I think there's an important lesson to learn here about these sons of Samuel. These two sons we have here, Joel and Abijah, is the fact that here are two men that are described as not walking in the ways of their father, who's turned aside after dishonest gain, are taking bribes and perverting justice. So Samuel we would uphold as a righteous individual. Samuel's a good man. But here his sons are not good men. They're nothing like their father. Here you have a righteous man in Samuel, but then you have sons that are willing to take bribes, that are willing to go after dishonest gain, people that are willing to pervert justice. And so because that's the sons of Samuel, then in verse 4, the elders of all Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said, "Look, you are now old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like the nations." So before they request a king, and we'll talk about their request for a king here in just a moment, understand this, one reason they came with this request, and we'll talk about the main reason in a minute, but one underlying reason is the sons of Samuel are nothing like him. And they're unrighteous individuals while their father is a righteous individual. So one of the key lessons we learn in that is, just because somebody has righteous parents does not mean they will necessarily be righteous themselves. Here's a righteous man in Samuel, yet he has dishonest sons. And you think as later on we get into the divided kingdom and you follow through, that you have some of the best kings whose sons were some of the worst kings, and then you have some of the better kings again. You think about like Hezekiah, when you get to the divided kingdom, who was one of, if not the best king in all of Judah. Yet there was no king that was worse than his son Manasseh. So as you follow through the kings, you'll see that story bear out as well as when we eventually get to the divided kingdom. But here's a principle that's important to understand. Just because somebody has righteous parents does not mean they will turn out righteous. You think about Eli and the way he did not restrain his sons earlier in the same book. And here his sons are, and they did whatever they wanted to do. He did not restrain them. There was a lack of discipline on his part. But then let's talk about the request that is made by Israel that they have a king. Look, now your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king. Make us a king to judge us like all the nations. What is the problem with the request? There's multiple parts wrong with the request, but look, what are some of the problems wrong with this request that the people of Israel have?
First, they turn to their own desires, not what God.
They're turning to their own way of thinking and not what God would have them to do. What else is wrong with this? They're ignoring God's kingship. And when Samuel, here in a moment when we get there, Samuel's thinking they're rebelling against him, and God's making the point that it's not against you, it's against me. What else do we see? They want to be like everybody else. You think about when you go all the way back to the book of Leviticus, and twice in Leviticus, it tells them they are to be holy for God is holy. In Leviticus chapter 11 and in verses 44 and 45, that is said. In a context about the eating of meats and what they could and could not eat. All the nations around them could eat whatever they want, but you have to eat these certain things, and then God says, you are holy for I am holy. What does it mean to be holy? Set apart. Then you skip over to chapter 19, chapter 18, and chapter 20 are dealing with the sexual sins. 19 is right there in the middle that's dealing with don't be like everybody else. And then in verse 2, be holy for I am holy. The same thing is quoted and applied to us in 1 Peter chapter 1 and in verse 15 and 16. That we're to be holy as God is holy. But you think about Israel, and from this point forward, really Israel has to this point not been living as holy people. That's why we have all this that's gone on in the book of Judges as we've studied. They were becoming like the nations around them. But as they began, this request was the beginning of more and more trouble. This is the basis is we want to have a king because we want to be like the nations around us. And you go from this point forward and you watch the history of Israel unfold. And then you're going to have the idol worship introduced. And then not only is it idol worship, but then there's the Baal worship. So it's not just any idols. Now it's Baal worship. And then you move on, so on and so forth. And what they did from that point forward, really, and they've done this before, but it just continues to get worse and worse from here, is they followed the way of the nations around them. That's why they were told in the days of Joshua to drive all the inhabitants of the land out. What's the reason we have the book of Judges is because they failed to do so. And they became like the nations around them. And so their request is, give us a king that we may be like the nations around us. But the problem with that is they're not supposed to be anything like them. They're called and set apart and a holy people. Let's pick up in verse 6. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel went and prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. You can imagine probably from Samuel's standpoint that he's thinking they're rejecting him, and here they've rejected his sons, and they're rejecting the leadership of Samuel. Because you follow throughout most of these judges that you follow from. In the book of Judges, we'll follow a judge until the time that they die. And here's Samuel, who's sitting and he's judging, and they're ready to have a king instead of having him to be the judge over them. And from Samuel's standpoint, it seems he's feeling like they're rebelling against him. It's him that they're rejecting. God makes the point that it's not you they have rejected. Hear the voice of the people and all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. I think it's an interesting point. When we look at this text and we think about they're choosing a king, and that this is them showing that they don't really want God being the one to reign over them. They want a king. But God makes the point when He's talking to Samuel here that they've done this by the works they have done all the way from the time they have left Egypt. This event just really shows that it's happening in front. But the point God's making to Samuel is this has been happening all along anyway. By the way they acted in the wilderness, by the way they've acted when they came into the land by not driving the people out, by the way they acted in the time of the judges where they rebelled constantly. The point that God's making to Samuel is, listen, Samuel, this is nothing new. This is what they've been doing all along. Now you see how I have felt all this time. Yeah. This is what they've done to me. And he puts out at the end of verse 8, so they are doing to you also. What they're doing to you, Samuel, and what you're feeling right now, is what they've been doing to me, their Creator, and the one that delivered them all along. So the fact is, Israel's not been living as they should all this time, which shows them rejecting God as their king in the manner of life. The statement is what we focus on, but I think it's important to understand the manner of life in which we lead can show a rejecting of God as being the ruler in our lives. That's exactly what was happening with those of Israel. But God tells Samuel in verse 9 to do what to the people? Tell him what He's going to do. Tell him what He's going to do. You want a king, that's fine. But before you get a king, let me forewarn you, this is what's going to happen. So here's Samuel's warning beginning at verse 10. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. We're in verse 10, now down to verse 11. And he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s, will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. And he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive gardens, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants. And you will cry out on that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. So here's the point that he's making now. That's fine. You want a king? You can have a king. But let me forewarn you of all the things, what he's going to take from you. And the male and the female servants and the vineyards and the best of the sheep and the best of the men and the best of the women. And he'll take your sons, he'll take your daughters, he'll put them to work for him. And he gives this warning, but I think it's important to notice in verse 18, look again in verse 18. And you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. And then in that day, all of a sudden, you're going to be regretting all this that you've done, and you're going to cry out to God for help because now your sons and your daughters are gone into the service of the king, and the male servants and the female servants, and he's taken your vineyards. Everything he's just told you he's going to take has been taken. And so now you cry out to God. But what does he say at the end of that verse? The Lord's not going to answer you that day. You have taken and you have rejected God. And so now you want to turn and you're rejecting God and you want to have somebody set up as a king. And you want to, instead of being a holy people, become like the nations around you. That's fine, do so. But understand this, when you cry out to God because of the forewarnings that were given to you, He's not going to hear you because you've not done what you need to do. So that's Samuel warning to the people. But then in 19 and 22, I would just simply title Israel demands a king. They've requested or asked for a king in 1-9. Samuel warned them about what will happen if they get a king. But the fact that they come back and they say it again tells me at this point they demand that they have a king. They don't care. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but we will have a king over us, so that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. So the Lord said to Samuel, heed their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, every man go to his city. And so here they've been fully forewarned. Samuel just told them all the Lord had told him. And it doesn't change their mind one bit. The fact that they now know God's not going to hear them. And you think about it too, it wasn't just that he sort of slid it in there in the middle where he made that statement. You know, it wasn't like when you're in a conversation, somebody may say something in the middle of a conversation but continue on, you don't even catch what was said in the middle. You see the way this is laid out? This isn't Samuel saying, and God's not going to hear you, and then the king's going to take your, and continue in the list. But he says, here's what the king's going to take, and he finishes with the warning that when you cry out, God's not going to hear you, and that does not change the mind of the people. It shows us something about the people of Israel, about the stubbornness of the people of Israel. They wanted it their way, and they wanted it their way right then. They didn't care what Samuel was telling them. They didn't care what God was telling them. They wanted it their way. And that was how they were going to have it. Again, to note, they wanted to be like the nations around them. You wonder as history moves forward, as you move forward in the history of Israel, how much they may have regretted that decision on that day. But Israel asked for and demanded a king. We'll see that king anointed here soon, but before we get there, we're going to 1 Samuel 9 in the story of Saul and Samuel. This is Saul searching. This divides itself into two major sections. The first is Saul is seeking the lost donkeys, 1 to 14, and the second is going to be with Samuel and Saul are together. Let's pick up at verse 1. Now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becherath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a choice and handsome son, whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel, for from his shoulders upwards he was taller than any of the people. Now we already know moving forward that Saul is the one that when we get into chapter 10 is anointed king. And then we move on through the story, we know what happens with Saul, and we'll see that next week unfold. But it's important to note here, the first king of Israel chosen was someone that looked the part. You know, when we get to David and the way that David is described, and you remember when Samuel comes into the house of Jesse later on, we'll see this next week, or we'll see this in a couple of weeks in 16, and he moves on down through the line and he goes through all the sons, till finally he gets to David, who's the youngest of them. And you know, this one looks the part of the king, and this one looks the part of the king, until he gets to David, who doesn't look the part of the king. But now, when you talk about Saul, Saul looked the part of the king. Look again in verse 2. He was choice and handsome. He was more handsome than all the rest of the people of Israel, and he stood shoulders above, and from his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. This just looked the part of a strong and a mighty man. Somebody that people would look at as a king and they would be proud of to have him being their representation. He looked the part of a king. Now the donkeys, verse 3 of Kish, Saul's father, were lost, and Kish said to his son Saul, please take one of the servants with you and arise, go and look for the donkeys. So he passed through the mountains of Ephraim and through the land of Shalisha, but they did not find them. Then they passed through the land of Shalim, and they were not there. Then he passed through the land of the Benjamites, but they did not find them. When they come to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, come, let us return, lest my father cease caring about the donkeys and become worried about us. And he said to him, look now, there is in this city, a man of God who is an honorable man. All that he says surely comes to pass. So let us go there. Perhaps he can show us the way that we should go. Then Saul said to the servant, but look, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread in our vessels is all gone, and there is no presence to bring the man of God. What do we have? And the servant answered Saul and said, look, I have here at hand 1/4 of a shekel of silver. I will give it to the man of God to tell us our way. Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he spoke thus, come, let us go to the seer. For he who is now called a prophet was formerly called a seer. Then Saul said to his servant, well said, come, let us go. So they went to the city where the man of God was. So here Saul and his servant are searching for these missing donkeys. And they've been searching for some time. You look at the list of the places they've gone through: the mountains of Ephraim, through Shalisha, through Shalem, through the land of the Benjamites. They've been through quite a bit of area trying to find them, and they can't find them. And Saul says, let's go back home before my father is not worried about the donkeys anymore that he sent us out to find them, becomes worried about us because we're not back. But then the servant says, well, there's a man of God. There's a man of God in this city. And how is this man of God described? Verse 6, how is he described? Honorable, and everything he says comes to pass. And we know as we get later, because we've read through this before, that we're talking about Samuel. But this tells you something. We talked earlier about Samuel's sons in chapter 8 and the kind of men they were and the description of them that was given. How they did not walk in the ways of Samuel, and they turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes and perverted justice. But Samuel's described as an honorable man. And someone that all he says comes to pass because he's a man of God. So the decision was made, let's go see this man of God. Now, we don't have a gift to take him. They found they had a fourth of a shekel of silver, so they took it. But let's inquire of the man of God what we can find out. Verse 11, as they went up to the hill in the city and met some young women going out to draw water and said to them, is the seer here? And they answered and said, yes, there he is, just ahead of you. Hurry now, for today he came to this city because there is a sacrifice of the people today on the high place. As soon as you come into the city, you will surely find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. For the people will not eat until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterward, those who are invited will eat. Now therefore go up, for about this time you will find him. So they went up to the city. As they were coming into the city, there was Samuel coming out toward them on his way to the high place. And then we'll pick up at 15, and we're going to follow Samuel and Saul in conversation here together. But they come into the city and they ask, where is he? They say, here he is. He's headed this way. He's going up to the high place for the sacrifice that's about to take place. Go quickly and find him. The people are not going to eat until he gets there and blesses the sacrifice. So let's pick up in verse 15. Now the Lord had told Samuel in his ear the day before Saul came, saying, tomorrow about this time I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him commander over my people Israel, that he may serve my people, that he may save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have looked upon my people, because their cry has come to me. So Samuel already knows coming in that at that time, the next day, because this happened the day before, at that time the next day, so now the day that we're reading about, that someone from the tribe of Benjamin was going to come to him, and this is the one who is to be anointed. So when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, there he is, the man of whom I spoke to you. This one shall reign over my people. Then Saul drew near to Samuel in the gate and said, please tell me, where is the seer's house? Samuel answered Saul and said, I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for you shall eat with me today, and tomorrow I will let you go and will tell you all that is in your heart. But as for your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, do not be anxious about them, for they have been found. And on whom is all the desire of Israel is not on you and all your father's house. So here Saul comes to Samuel, and Samuel says, he asked him, where's the seer? Later on they'll call them prophets, but at this point they were asked where the seer was. Samuel says, I am the seer. And he explains that the donkeys have been found. But he tells him again, verse 20, and on whom is all the desire of Israel is it not on you and all your father's house? Here's Saul's reply. Am I not a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel? And my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak like this to me? I'm of Benjamin, which is the smallest of the tribes. Not only am I of the smallest of the tribes, I'm of the smallest of the families of the smallest of the tribes. I'm of the smallest of all the people of Israel. What judge does that sound like, by the way? What judge made a similar statement? Gideon. Think about Gideon. I'm of the least of, my family's of the least of the clans. Talk about Gideon being humble there. Here's Saul. I think sometimes we always talk about Saul and what we remember later on, what we're going to get next week and what we remember later on about the story of Saul. But let's not forget that Saul was humble at the beginning of his reign. Here's somebody that says, I'm of the smallest of tribes. Why would you speak like that to me? Now Samuel took Saul and his servant, verse 22, and brought them into the hall, and had them sit in the place of honor among those who were invited. There were about 30 persons. Not only is he telling this, they then take Saul and his servant and put them in a place of honor. And Samuel said to the cook, "Bring the portion which I gave you, of which I said to you, set it apart." The cook took up the thigh with its upper part and set it before Saul. And Samuel said, "Here it is, what was kept back. It was set apart for you. Eat, for until this time it has been kept for you, since I said, I invited the people." So Saul ate with Samuel that day. Now when they had come down from the high place into the city, Samuel spoke with Saul on the top of the house. They arose early, and it was about the dawning of the day that Samuel called to Saul on top of the house, saying, "Get up, that I may send you on your way." And Saul arose, and both of them went outside, he and Samuel. And they were going down to the outskirts of the city. Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to go on ahead of us." And he went on, "But you stand here a while, that I may announce to you the word of God." So now he's going to send his servant on, and this part, verse 27, is going to go into chapter 10, where we're going to have Saul announced and introduced as king. He's anointed as king, verses 1 to 8. Remember, chapter 9 is its ending. They've gone up, and Samuel's going to talk to Saul, and he tells him he's going to announce to him the word of God in verse 27 of chapter 9. Here's how chapter 10 in verse 1 opens up. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head, and kissed him and said, Is it not because the Lord has anointed you commander over his inheritance? When you have departed from me today, you will find 2 men by Rachel's tomb in the territory of Benjamin at Zelzah. And they will say to you, The donkeys which you went to look for have been found. And now your father, as he's caring about the donkeys and is worried about you, saying, What shall I do about my son? Then you shall go on forth from there and come to the terebinth tree of Tabor. There are 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you, one carrying 3 young goats, and another carrying 3 loaves of bread, and another carrying a skin of wine. And they will greet you and give you 2 loaves of bread, which you shall receive from their hands. After that you shall come to the hill of God, where the Philistines' garrison is. And it will happen when you come there to the city that you will meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place with a stringed instrument, a tambourine, a flute, and a harp before them. And they will be prophesying. Then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with them and be turned into another man. And let it be when these signs come to you that you do on the occasion as the occasion demands, for God is with you. You shall go down before him to Gilgal, and surely I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings and make sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait till I come to you and show you what you should do. So in verse 1, he is anointed as king, but now he's telling him, here's what's going to happen. Here he's foretelling what's going to take place shortly thereafter. It's going to be a sign to Saul. You're going to go down, you're going to see the 2 men over here, you'll see the 3 men here. They'll give you the 3 men will give you 2 loaves of bread. Then you'll go on a little farther, you'll see the prophets coming down with the stringed instruments. When you see them, you're going to begin to prophesy. You'll be as another man. And then in 7 days, I will come down and get you, and then you'll await further instruction from there. So 9 to 16 is where Saul is prophesying. What was just prophesied, what was just told by Samuel to Saul is what's fixing to take place. So it was, verse 9, when he turned his back to go from Samuel, that God gave him another heart, and all those signs came to pass that day. When they came there to the hill, there was a group of prophets to meet him. Then the Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied among them. And it happened when all who knew him formerly saw that he indeed prophesied among the prophets, that the people said to one another, What is this that has come to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? Then a man from their answer said, But who is their father? Therefore it became a proverb, Is Saul among the prophets? When he finished prophesying, he went to the high place. So here he comes, and exactly what was told takes place. Now, it may be something that sort of goes easily unnoticed in this text, but that shows us the fact that God can be trusted. It may not be one of those things that just jumps off the page at us in that text, but this is what God told Samuel was going to take place, and so Samuel told it to Saul, and it happened exactly as was told by God to Samuel and Samuel to Saul. It shows us the power of the Word of God and that it can be trusted. And then, of course, he prophesies, and now they're trying to wonder what has happened to Saul. Something has changed. This is not the same man that left here a few days ago. Verse 14, then Samuel's uncle said to him and his servant, "Where did you go?" So he said, to look for the donkeys. When we saw that they were nowhere to be found, we went to Samuel. And Saul's uncle said, "Tell me, please, what Samuel said to you." So Saul said to his uncle, he told us plainly the donkeys had been found. But about the matter of the kingdom, he did not tell him what Samuel had said. He's awaiting further instruction. He's not been introduced yet. He's been anointed, but he's not introduced as king till here in just a moment. And so he doesn't even tell his uncle yet what has taken place here in verses 14 through 16. But in verse 17 to 27, that should be Saul's announced as king. And Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah, and said to the children of Israel, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt and delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of the kingdoms, of all the kingdoms and from those who oppressed you. But you have today rejected your God, who himself saved you from all your adversities and your tribulations. And you have said to him, No, set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans." And for time's sake, we'll go through this rather quickly, skim through this rather quickly, but they go from the tribes and the clans. And as they go from the tribes, a lot falls on Benjamin. They go to the tribe of Benjamin. It falls on the house of Kish. They end up with Saul. So verse 21, when they caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near by the families, the family of Matri was chosen, and Saul the son of Kish was chosen. When they had sought him, he could not be found. And again, here's something that tells us about the humility of Saul. So they inquired of the Lord further, "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord answered, "There he is, hidden among the equipment." You know, a man that later on, for all the things we'll criticize him for, quite humble, he doesn't even want to be there to be announced as king. He's sort of hiding. Doesn't see himself as somebody fit to be the king, as it would appear. But they ran and brought him, and they shouted, "Long live the king." In verse 25, Samuel explained to the people the behavior of royalty and wrote it in the book and laid it before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house, and he goes home to Gibeah. And so that is the story of the announcement of Saul as king. But let's go through here. I want to spend some time, a few minutes here, before we get to practical lessons, on the story of Saul defending Jabesh Gilead. It's particularly one phrase in this text that is very important. 1-4, messengers are sent from Jabesh Gilead to Saul. The Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, make a covenant with us, and we will serve you. And Nahash the Ammonite answered and said, "On this occasion I will make a covenant with you, that I may put out all of your eyes and bring reproach on all Israel." So they think, well, let's go negotiate with him. And he said, "I will negotiate with you and make a treaty with you, but I'm going to poke out all your eyes." So they asked, the elders of Jabesh said, "Hold off for 7 days. We may send messengers to all the territory of Israel, and then if there is no one to save us, we will come out to you." So the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and told the news in the hearing of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. And so the messengers come in verse 4. Now here's the response. Saul's going to come and defend the people of Jabesh Gilead. "Now there was Saul coming before the herd from the field, and Saul said, 'What troubles the people? Why do they weep?'" By the way, here's something about Saul. Where is Saul at this point? In verse 5. He's coming out of the field. It's not until later on that you see him actually beginning to more act the part of a king. But he's in the field. But he comes out and says, what troubles the people? Why do they weep? So they told him the words of the men of Jabesh. And the Spirit of God came upon Saul in verse 6 when he heard the news, and his anger was greatly aroused. So he took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hands of the messenger, saying, whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to his oxen. So here you imagine he takes this yoke of oxen and they cut it up and they send out the messengers who come in and they'll come to the house. And can you imagine being there and you get a knock on your door? And then somebody shows the message. So whoever doesn't come and join Saul and Samuel, his oxen will be like this oxen right here. And there they will hold this bloody piece of meat that has been cut from this oxen. And they'll move on down to the next place and so on and so forth. And so the statement is said in verse 7, and the fear of the Lord fell on the people. They came out with one consent. Fear can have two components. We often talk about fear having two components, reverence and respect. But fear can mean they are afraid. Both of those can be referred to. And in this case, when the fear of the Lord falls upon them, they are terrified of what has just been told to them. If you don't come and fight with Saul and Samuel this day, so this will be done to your oxen. So this fear falls upon all the people. And so because of this fear, they come together and came out with one consent. When he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. And they said to the messengers who came, thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, you shall have help. Then the messengers came and reported it to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Therefore the men of Jabesh said, tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do with us whatever seems good to you. So it was on the next day that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came in the midst of the camp in the morning watch and killed Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it happened that those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. And the people said to Samuel, who is he who said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring them in, that we may put them to death. But Saul said, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel. You know, I can't help but, as you move through this text, first of all, appreciate some of the statements and the things about Saul that are said here early on in his reign. You think about how the text ends in the previous one. In verse 27 of chapter 10, we skipped over it, but some rebels said, how can this man save us? For they despised him and brought him no presents. But he held his peace. And then here the people come after this great delivery, this defeating of the Ammonites at Jabesh Gilead, and Saul and Samuel come and they free Jabesh. And the people that are there fighting with Saul say, who are the men that said that Saul couldn't save us? Let's bring them and let's put them to death for that. Here they are. They are questioning his leadership, and so let's put him to death. And you know, most kings would have taken and gladly put him to death. But not Saul early on in his reign. Not Saul early on. In fact, where does Saul give the glory in this victory? He gives the glory to God. Again, we're often hard on Saul, and rightfully so, for the latter half of his life. But there are some valuable and important lessons and things that we should follow from some of the early things he did. Here in chapter 11, the fact is he was willing to give the glory to God. He was willing to give the glory to God and not try and take the glory for himself. Then Samuel said to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they made sacrifice of peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So they go and they make him king there at Gilgal, and celebrate and rejoice. Let's talk about some practical lessons we learned. We've gone through that material rather quickly this evening, but what are some practical lessons we can learn from this text? What are some practical lessons y'all see in this text?
God is the
God is in control. God needs to be first. God's in control and God is first. If God is in control, they were able to deliver him from the hand of Jabesh. I think of the passage in Daniel, God rules in the kingdoms of men. God needs to be first. They were seeking for their own desires and establishing a king. They wanted to be like everybody else around them, but they weren't trying to follow what God would have them to follow. What else do we see in this text? Good point. God's people weren't meant to blend in, but meant to stand out. You know, we talk about that idea of being holy. Israel is being anything but holy. And then they're asking for a king, or in any of the other actions that they take. They have done anything but try and be holy. Here's some lessons we have. The dangers of trying to be like the world. You know, you think about the warning that was given by Samuel. You want to be like the world, that's fine. You want to have a king to be like the world, that's fine. Here's what's going to happen. And remember, when you do that God's not going to hear you. Now, we may not be sitting there today going, give us a king, and crying out like the people did. But in our manner of life, we can reject God as being first in our lives. And when we do so, and we just all of a sudden try and turn to Him because things get difficult, without ever making any real change, then we're not going to be heard in the day of adversity. Just like the people of Israel weren't going to be heard when they cried out to God after they had been forewarned but did not follow the commands given. Talk about God being the true king, God being first. They rejected God as king. And so God needed to be first, and they rejected God as their true king. He didn't take an important enough part in their life. But here's one that we didn't really spend enough time. We didn't spend much time talking about the importance of listening to good advice. When Samuel comes and he says, if you want a king, I want you to understand all the consequences, the ramification, long-term ramifications of making such a decision. Here's what they are. And he lays it out before them. All this is what's going to happen. But the people don't listen to that. People aren't willing to listen to that. I hear the importance of listening to the good advice. Because if the people had listened to what Samuel was trying to tell them about what would happen, they might have changed their minds about having a king. And that could have made a big difference. When instead they wanted a king, they were set on having a king. And I also learned that when people are stubborn enough to want what they want, they're not willing to listen to advice. They were so set on having a king, they didn't care what Samuel told them. They were going to have a king. They wanted it their way. Another important is choosing another ruler is rejecting God. Whenever anything takes the place of God in our lives, while women, again, today may not physically ask for the king to set up, something may take the place of God in our life. Something else may be first in our lives. We're choosing something else to be the ruler in our lives. And when we do so, we're rejecting God. We reject God and reject God as being first in our lives by each and every action we take, just like Israel did. Or God made the point to Samuel that basically, this is nothing new. This is what they've been doing all along.
That reminds me of the verse in Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path.
Right. Putting the trust in Him. But oftentimes people put the trust, as it says, lean not on your understanding, but people rely more on their own understanding than putting the trust in God. And this is how they want it, and that's how man sees fit and sees best. And so they reject God's way. The last of those is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord. The being afraid aspect of fear of the Lord. Again, fear of the Lord can carry to it with the idea of reverence and respect, or with being afraid. I think sometimes we get the idea that we can't be afraid of God. But the fear of the Lord came upon them. We're afraid because we know that He will keep His word. Just as He did in this text where it was told us all what was going to happen, and so it was. And so we need to be afraid of the consequences of not obeying God. Just like the people were afraid of the consequences of not joining in with Saul and Samuel to go fight in Jabesh, we need to be afraid of what will happen if we do not obey God and His word. Thank you for your attention this evening.